All right, you found your site. Now it's time to excavate. Before you begin excavating, it's important to remember that what the information we're capturing tells us are not only spatial relationships, but where we are in time. So as we dig vertical levels down into an excavation unit, we're going back in time, theoretically. Horizontally, then, we're looking at changes across space. So there's x, y dimension for space, and then the z dimension provides us with that depth or going in changes in time. There are several stages when it comes to an excavation, and I'm going to walk you through, an example using some of the research I've participated in the past. But you can come back and review this list later on if you want to refamiliarize yourself with how it's all done. So, one of the first things you want to do is establish what's called a site datum, and that is going to help you tie into the GPS system, the mapping system you're going to use throughout the entire project. Now, ideally, you want to find a place that's off-site, but not too far, so that your total station, which is the equipment you're seeing here, can still see what's happening and still make measurements on the site that you see in the background here. This is a nice little diagram that shows us, how you would take your depth measurements using the total station. So that's this guy with the guy standing in the unit itself. You're able to, if you know the height from the ground surface where you are to the top of your total station, you're then able to tie in the measurements to know exactly how deep you are within the site. These mapping technologies also let you control for the spatial relationships of different artifacts or features that you identify within your grid system. What that information ultimately tells you is the provenience, or the specific context from which different artifacts or features were recovered from. And this is everything when it comes to archaeology. If you don't have the provenience information anymore, it's going to be really hard to use that data to its full ability, because you no longer have the association with other artifacts, other features to help you interpret why those things ended up there in the first place. So in the image on the right, you can see this same arrowhead in several different contexts, as we would refer to it, and those contexts confer different meanings then for how that object came to be in that place, what the significance of that placement might have been for past peoples. One that's left in a burial is some sort of grave good for that person versus someone who was killed by some sort of arrowhead, which you can see in some of the other examples. All right, you have your grid system. You've mapped it into some sort of GPS coordinate system. This allows you to know where you are in space while you're doing your excavation. And you can see in this photo, they've decided to leave a little bit of what we call bulk in between their excavation units. These look like 1x2s, whereas in this image on the right, they've opened up a much larger area. I can't even tell exactly how big it is. But even though it's a large area that's open, they're able to maintain that spatial control using the strings that represent the grid system. For one of the cases I've worked on in the past, which is Roadmap Pueblo in New Mexico, we were actually using the Pueblo rooms themselves as the excavation units. So we had identified where the walls were from the surface. That allowed us to then decide, assign numbers to the different Pueblo rooms, and those were our entire unit of excavation. Now, as we started excavating, we started coming across what could have been potential features. So the wall fall that you see in the image on the left, these nicely aligned rocks, that's at least how we interpreted it, that this whole wall would have fallen into the room in this direction, therefore laying the rocks down in this nice alignment. We also found burned beams in the unit itself, which probably were part of an upper floor or roof deposit. I think I've shown you this photo before, but ultimately within our Pueblo room then, we found a hearth deposit. And when you find any kind of floor features like this, you're going to want to excavate each of those individually and save the material that comes out of those for potential flotation analysis, which is something we'll talk about in a little bit. any kind of, especially hearth, you're going to have charcoal fragments, seeds, or other things in there that you'd want to capture because that data is really important. As you're excavating, everything that comes out of the same unit at the same level goes into the same bag. So you see here a set of bags. They're probably representing different material types, maybe one for flaked stone, one for ceramics, one for bones. All of this information needs to go onto every single bag, and that needs to go from the field to the lab, and any other samples that need to be maintained in the long term. You need to have all that information on there. That's that provenience information that's so essential. Okay, so you're digging all these buckets of dirt out. You've got to run them through your screen then to see what all is there, because you can't always see it right away. Sometimes there's these big dirt clods that you have to break up, or maybe you're working in an area where you actually have to wet screen because there's so much moisture in the soil itself. There's many different styles of screens, as you can see from the images here. Typically, quarter-size mesh is what you want to use. Sometimes you're going to use even finer mesh to capture things like fish bones or eggshells, or, depending on what sort of materials you think you're going to be getting out of the site. Here is some of the pottery that we recovered from the Pueblo site in New Mexico. So every time you come back from the field, you wash your artifacts for the day, leave them out to dry, so they can be bagged up without any kind of mold or other sort of moisture going in there with them. We do usually conduct some basic lab analysis while still in the field. These are some field school students who are working on at least doing some basic sorting of the pottery based on the typology that's known for the region. Flotation, I mentioned this earlier. So this is a technique that allows us to recover the very, very fine fragments of small animal bones, plant remains, other sorts of delicate materials, seeds, the things that would have been left behind, like I said before, in a hearth, for example. So what you do is you pour your sample into a large bucket or some other sort of contraption, as you can see up here, with a bunch of water, and it allows the light material to float up to the surface and then get siphoned off into what you can see here is like the very fine, like silky sort of mesh material. The water pours into that, and only the light fraction stays behind, and that you hang that up to dry, as you can see back here, so that your paleobotanists later on can analyze that material. And there will be a video for you to take a look at with Karen Adams, who's a pretty famous paleobotanist for the Southwest, if you're interested. Documentation. This is everything. As soon as you start excavating a site, you are destroying that site. So if you don't do a good enough job documenting your information and your finds, then it's all waste. You need to be recording all sorts of information. Soil differences in the texture, the color, any kind of changes in the frequencies of artifacts that you're encountering over as you dig down. This is the information that's going to let you interpret what you're seeing at a later stage. Part of that documentation involves photography, so you want to take, photos at every level to document differences in the stratigraphy that you're observing or any sort of feature locations within a unit. It's important when taking that photo to make sure you have consistent lighting across it, and my favorite sort of shade structures is using human shade to ensure that you're getting equal light across the unit that's being photographed. Mapping, as we talked about in the survey lecture, this allows you to record the exact provenience of unique finds or different features. Later on, you can create these really cool 3D reconstructions of the excavated areas. What sort of things would you want to map? Well, the wooden beams that we came across would be an important feature to note with an exact point. Also, any kind of reconstructible vessel, like what you're seeing in the photos on the right. If you aren't using a total station to map all these things in directly, you can use piece plotting, or point proveniencing is what we sometimes call it. So in addition to your site datum, every unit usually has its own datum, which is this little pole rebar here in the ground. That is shot into the greater grid for the site, and then you're able to, as he's doing here, pull a string across from the datum itself, measure down to where that particular feature is, and you have your XYZ information for that particular feature or that particular artifact. When you're done excavating a unit, you need to profile, and that means creating a map of at least two of the walls, so a north and south, north or south, or east or west, but you're trying to capture the important stratigraphy that you need to remember when drawing your interpretations later on. Also, any major features on the floor, in particular, like our hearth that you see here, or this large post hole in the middle. You need to create a profile showing the depth. It's basically a cross-section map through the feature itself. Here are some of our field school students. You can see you've established a tape. Across the wall itself, the nails of the mapping profile area are shot in with total station, and then you can see he's measuring down from that tape to get the exact depth of different rocks, and that's how you record the features, the stratigraphy within the profile itself, and ultimately get these nice little maps on the grid paper that you can see here. Photos at the very end, marking, you've got your north arrow showing the direction, any kind of spatial information that's important to keep for different walls, the floor features itself. Also creating a map of those to preserve the information. And this is a really fancy one from Teotihuacan project, showing you not only the floor features, but each of the 4 walls after the excavation is complete. The last, and what sometimes can be the most fun stage, is backfilling. You have to put all the dirt you excavated back into those units, because that is what ultimately is going to protect and preserve that site for future excavation.